so a lot of a weird thing you have when in Orthodoxy we have no standardized translations into English. So the Greeks will do one thing, Antiochians do another, and the Russians. And then the problem is sometimes like the Antiochians like to use these and thous, and Greeks like to use you and your. And so sometimes in the middle of one prayer, I'll shift between you and thou, and it's annoying. So I apologize. Okay. We are covering the Gospel of Matthew chapter 2 today, and it's my intention to get through all of it. I hope we'll succeed, but we're already a little late, so things are not boding well. But that's okay. That's okay. We're going to have fun. I'm going to have fun. You can have fun or not. It's your business. Okay, so we're just going to jump right into it. Gospel of Matthew chapter 2. Although, what did we just have? We just had in Gospel Matthew chapter 1, we just went through the genealogy of Jesus and then the virgin birth of Jesus, and how Joseph suspected her of adultery, but then was informed in a dream that the child she had was of the Holy Spirit. And that was that. Now we're going to get into the immediate aftermath of the birth of Jesus. So now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men coming from the east, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him." So just a few things about this so far. So the first thing, just to correct some misconceptions, it says after Jesus was born. The pop culture image we have of the Magi coming and laying down their gifts at Jesus' feet on the night of his birth is not what happened. In fact, it was within some unspecified length of time that could have been as many as 2 years. Why do we know that? I'll get to why. Well, it's basically because Herod had all children 2 years and under put to death because he couldn't pin down the exact time the child was born. So he had to just estimate, let's say, in sort of a grisly way. Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, and that's significant. They mentioned of Judea, that means of Judah. Remember that the promised land, Israel, was divided up among the 12 tribes of Israel, and the particular line and the particular territory that Jesus is born into is Judah. He's of the line of Judah. That's why, and remember, the kings of Israel came from Judah, so it's significant that, and there were 2 Bethlehems. That's another thing. So it's Bethlehem of Judah, Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king. And behold, wise men coming from the east. Wise men, it's magi. It's where we get the word like mage, and I mean honestly, we get the word wizard from wise too. And so this word is associated with magic at that time, but it's also just the educated and scholarly people. Most of the fathers and basically the ancient tradition is that these were Chaldeans. So from where Abraham was from, that area near Iraq, basically. There's also the tradition that there were Persians too. But the important thing is that they were Gentiles. They were not Jews, but they were coming to seek out the King of the Jews. And that's interesting, and we're going to get that into it. But part of the significance is that, remember, I've said in the past that one of the prophecies that was most significant in the Old Testament that Jesus fulfills is that Jesus brings non-Jews into the covenant. He expands the covenant that originally God made a covenant with his people, the children of Abraham, and the Messiah is going to expand it such that Gentiles come and worship the God of Abraham. And now we see even by his birth, Jesus is already fulfilling some of the messianic prophecies. Why? Because some Gentiles, some non-Jews are coming to worship and fall down before the God of Abraham. So this is significant. We're going to get into where they might have come from and so on. So where is he who has been born a King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him. So this is really interesting because why? What's going on here? Why would Persians be interested in the King of the Jews or Chaldeans or whatever they were? Where would they get this information about a prophecy? We don't necessarily know. Now we know that the Jews had more interaction, including religious interaction, with the peoples around them than we sometimes give them credit for. So even like Cyrus the Great when he sends the Jews back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. He's concerned with pleasing the God of heaven by allowing them to do that. So there's this kind of widespread acknowledgement that maybe all peoples worship the same God, or at least they have this primordial memory of the one true God, because everyone was children of Noah, and Noah taught his children how to worship the one true God. But it's possible in a number of ways that they had access to some kind of prophecy that would talk about the Messiah. But actually, in Christian tradition, in among the fathers, they nail it down to a specific prophecy, which is in Numbers, Numbers chapter 24. Yes, it's Numbers 24, verse 15 to 19. So this is Balaam, son of Beor, who was a Gentile, who was supposed to prophesy against Israel, but then he goes and prophesies, and well, we can read it, but he ends up prophesying on behalf of Israel, perhaps unintentionally. But he's a Gentile prophet. He's a Gentile who somehow is in the book of Numbers. Who despite not being part of the people of God, ends up with this gift of prophecy and ends up speaking on behalf of the God of heaven. So here we have Numbers chapter 24, verse 15. So he took up his parable and said, Balaam the son of Beor declares, the man who truly sees declares, the one who hears the sayings of God declares, and the one who knows the knowledge of the Most High, and who saw the vision of God in a dream and a revelation seen by him, I will show him, but not now. I bless him, but he is not near. A star shall rise out of Jacob, and a man shall rise out of Israel. He shall break in pieces the rulers of Moab and plunder all the sons of Seth. Edom shall be his inheritance, and his enemies shall be his inheritance. But Israel acts with strength. He acts with to rise up out of Jacob and destroy the survivors of the city. So a number of interesting things right here. What does all of this mean? So first of all, we have a Gentile prophesying on behalf of God. Second, he says, I bless him. I will show him, but not now. I bless him, but he is not near. But this prophecy was made about 1,200 years before Christ, give or take. So it makes sense that the prophecy would say, I see him, but he is not near at that time. But a star shall rise out of Jacob. So that's where they get the notion of a star, right? Or that's where the fathers see them getting this notion of a star being the sign. Now, the people of the ancient world were like really into astronomy, to astrology, not astronomy. Well, there wasn't that harsh distinction, right? They weren't so clearly separate things, but they were really interested in astrology and discerning the stars. You know, we can go back and look at like Babylonian or Sumerian star charts or whatever, and they were people back then were really interested in examining the heavens and figuring out what was going on up there and what it meant. Of course, they were always looking for meanings. They were always looking for prophecies. So it's not at all implausible, just on the face of it, that people from the ancient Near East were looking for signs from heaven to tell them things about the future. And now you have this Gentile prophet in the ancient Near East who is saying pretty concrete things. Well, relatively concrete things. I mean, prophecy is really, kind of vague in some ways. But a man shall rise out of Israel. That's self-explanatory, and shall break in pieces the rulers of Moab. Remember, Moab were Gentile enemies of the Israelites, and in this case, they're taken as a metaphor for Satan and the demonic power. So a Messiah is going to come, and he's going to destroy who? The devil, the enemies of the people of God, and plunder all the sons of Seth. Jonathan says, in the archaeological evidence we have says that Balaam was a famous prophet, probably a folk hero. So I imagine his prophecies would have garnered much attention. That's interesting. I didn't realize we had archaeological evidence on the side of this. Thank you for that contribution. That is cool. So now we actually, I guess, have a level of quote unquote objective evidence that might testify to the fact that Balaam really was a prophet that non-Jews were interested in the prophecies of, and plunder all the sons of Seth. Now, I think there's some translation concerns here, and this might be a little nebulous, but the sons of Seth, who are the sons of Seth? Well, more or less everybody, because Seth was the third child of Adam and Eve. And then Noah is descended from Seth's line. So all human beings alive on earth at this time are children of Seth. So Christ is going to plunder all of them. Well, he's going to take them captive, take them to himself. Edom shall be his inheritance. Again, Edom is also Esau. It's suffice it to say, it's also very, very often used by the Jews as a metaphor for all Gentiles. Edom was one specific tribe, one specific kingdom, but they often referred to all Gentiles as Edom or Esau. So the Gentiles shall be his inheritance. Well, what does Jesus Christ do? Well, he inherits the Gentiles by bringing them into the church. And also his enemies shall be his inheritance, but Israel acts with strength. He shall rise out of Jacob and destroy the survivors of the city. So basically, the long story short is this does seem to be a Gentile prophet talking about the Messiah coming in the form of a star or represented by a star. And he's going to do what? He's going to take captive the Gentiles, and he's going to destroy the enemies of Israel, like Moab. And so it sounds like Jesus. It sounds like, again, it's not, prophecy is somewhat abstract. It's somewhat mysterious. So you can't always say with like, oh, this is 100% certainly exactly how they would have interpreted it, or this is exactly that prophecy, but you can see how they get there, and it makes a good bit of sense. So it's quite possible that this really was, and even the fathers, when they're commenting on this, they don't say it as a certainty, but they think it's likely that this is the prophecy that the wise men were following. So even though, and it has some interesting lessons for us. Well, first, let me dispel one thing. They knew the star was not a star. Like sometimes hey, how's it going? Sometimes we underestimate the knowledge of ancient people, and it's true they had less scientific knowledge than us, and there were some things of which they were utterly ignorant. But even if you read the patristic commentaries, they know that this is not a star. They know this was some kind of bright light in the heavens, but it came down and hovered over the house where Jesus was. They knew even then that stars don't do that. So St. John Chrysostom says it was an angel. And this is important because it makes the point that even though the religion of the Magi, whether they were like Zoroastrians or something, or some, other religious system that we don't know, that's been long forgotten, even though the religion of the Magi was erroneous, it still can guide them to the truth, which is Christ. So that's not saying that all religions are just as good as one another, but it is saying that there is some level of truth to be found everywhere. And in general, when Orthodox Christians go out and mission to other peoples with other gods, not always, but very often the strategy is to hear about their ancestral traditions and say, okay, you got most of the story. Here's the rest. Because a lot of these stories would be based on some kind of deep ancestral memory of the true God or something like that. So on the one hand, we don't believe in the truth of those other religions. And on the other hand, they still have some sort of value in leading someone to the truth. And they're not just totally something that should be cast out. Okay. As C.S. Lewis called it, Christ is the true myth. Yeah, I think, I'd have to read that in context to see exactly what he's talking about. But certainly it's a lot of these ancient heroes or gods or stories point to the reality of Christ. So it's not that they need to be thrown out wholesale, baby in bathwater, but that they can be redeemed and actually okay. And then one more thing when reading through these commentaries, this was a separate thought that came to me, but I think it's just worth sharing with you guys because in my experience, like a lot of people have needed to hear this. When you read the patristic commentaries on the Gospel of Matthew chapter 2, they're just pages and pages of the Father saying, now don't go believing in astrology. They're really, really very anxious to make sure that you don't start looking at the stars and discerning fate from it. And that it's totally wrong and that human beings have free will and so on and so forth. And the stars and planets do not control your destiny. And it's just really interesting to me because they were so concerned about astrology. And here I am, you guys, everyone, in our parish, all Christians in the modern day, struggle to some degree with doubt or with unbelief or something like that. And it's just interesting that I'm not really worried about any of you guys falling to astrology. It's our temptation to unbelief in the modern day is different. In our modern American context. But that's all it is. It's a temptation to unbelief. You know, in this day and age, we are seduced by things like atheism or something like that. In people back then, it really wasn't on the table, or at least not for most of them. It was something like astrology or some other religious system. Those who were here and saw Bishop, we were at the monastery and Bishop Themi spoke. In West Africa, they have a totally different form of unbelief that they need to wrestle with. None of the people out in Sierra Leone are going and becoming atheists, but they are very mixed up with juju. They're very mixed up with magic. And so the only constant in all of this is orthodoxy. And these are all, at the bottom of it, just temptations of the devil. So when you get agonized by doubts or temptations like that or something, understand that it's illusory. It's just the devil's temptation against you. And if you lived in a different cultural context, it would be something else that would tempt you. It's not because of the supremacy of our modern logic and reason or something like that that we have doubts now. People in every age had doubts, but it's what they doubted and why was different. And it's just because it's always been the devil's strategy is to puff you up in your heart to make you so proud that you turn away from the truth of Christ. Anywho, but it's not because there's necessarily any substance to it. Now there are legitimate doubts a person can have, or in the sense that I don't want to say legitimate doubts, but there are real questions you can have, or real questions that deserve a strong answer, or something like that. But so I don't want to say just no, never question anything, but I'm just saying don't get so in your own head about the fact that you have doubts or something. Just it's a temptation, brush it aside. Okay. Now moving on to verse 3. Oh, we've gotten so far in 20 minutes. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And when he gathered all the chief priests and scribes of the people together, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. So Herod was troubled. Why is Herod troubled? Herod is troubled because so now the Magi, the wise men, have gone to him and said, oh, the king of the Jews is being born. Herod is troubled because he is an illegitimate king. So Herod has an interesting ancestry, and I went and looked it up in anticipation of this little lesson to make sure I had my facts straight. So he is a descendant of the Hasmoneans, who took control. So they fought a war. So he's a descendant of the Maccabees, who fought a war of liberation in Judea in like the 150 BC era for liberation from the Greeks. So the Seleucid Empire was a successor state of Alexander the Great, and so they fought a war of liberation. But remember, the leaders, the kings of Judah, are the kings of Israel, the kings of God's people are supposed to come from the line of Judah, from the tribe of Judah, through David. The Hasmoneans, the Maccabees, were of the tribe of Levi. So they knew on the face of it that they weren't the ones meant to rule Israel. On top of that, Herod himself is apparently of somewhat mixed ancestry. So he's partly an Idumean, or mostly an Idumean, which is something like sorry?
Edomite.
An Edomite. Oh, okay. Yeah, so he's from one of the historical racial enemies of the Israelites. So even worse. So he's got these two strikes against him. On his on the one hand, his Jewish ancestry is only partial, and on the other hand, even his Jewish ancestry does not set him up legitimately for the throne. And he knew that, and people knew that. It wasn't a secret. So he's very aware that his legitimacy is questionable. Okay. And also in reading this, I just want to mention that the commentaries all say, or many of the commentaries say, that Herod represents the devil, because the dominion of both the devil, the devil rules the world until the coming of Christ. He still partly rules the world now, but his rule is being challenged, is being conquered. But Herod's rule is threatened by the coming of Christ, and the devil's rule is also is also threatened by Christ. So Herod is a stand-in for the devil. Yes.
The Old Testament prophecies allude to Jesus coming to be a king as we understand it. Like, what was he fearful of? He's not fearful of a man who's going to go out and teach and eventually sacrifice himself.
Right.
So what was he?
So the Old Testament prophecies are very interesting because they kind of describe two aspects. On the one hand, they do describe like a king, like a political ruler, and in fact, historically, Jews have interpreted it more in the light of historical rulership. But at the same time, there are also prophecies that say the Messiah has to suffer, like in Isaiah 53, and even that he has to be put to death, like in Daniel 9. So it's very mysterious and in fact contradictory. And so if you want to read something on the subject, I'd recommend St. Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho, where he goes through like very deeply in the Old Testament, because St. Justin Martyr is a church father who's debating with a Jewish rabbi named Trypho, and he's going through and he's showing all the ways that the prophecies point to Christ. And part of it is that there's this a bit of a contradictory element or a bit of mysterious element, that on the one hand the Messiah is supposed to be a king, and on the other hand he is supposed to suffer and die. So suffice it to say that Herod did definitely interpret it, at least that a real political king is going to come, for sure. But actually, also in some of the patristic commentaries I was reading on this, Herod is ruling. Herod is ruling the Jews, but he's ruling with the blessing of Rome. And actually, he is worried, and this comes up later in the Gospels. Some of the fathers think that the reason he was worried was because if the Romans hear about someone else being proclaimed king, like if he can't keep his people under control, they're going to execute him. And put someone else in his place. So that could be another reason he was scared. So it's a good question. And when he gathered all the chief priests and the scribes of the people together, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. And now this is really interesting detail, because it sounds like he's taking the prophecy seriously. It sounds like he's believing in the scriptures. So why, in your right mind, would you want to go against God's anointed? I mean, that's totally wacky. Now, I think it's, once you get into the actual dynamics of beliefs in real life people, it's not as surprising because people have a lot of contradictory beliefs and so on and so forth. But the fathers see this is the influence of the devil again. Whereas the demons all believe in God, obviously, they believe in the existence of God, but they have a warped view of it. Satan has a warped view of God in thinking that he can somehow defeat God or get God out of the picture and put himself on the throne or something like that. So Herod right here is espousing the worldview of demons, which is partial belief, but a twisted belief, a warped belief. He believes the scriptures are real, but he also believes that the Messiah can be killed and then just made done with, which is what the devil believed, right? I mean, I've said that before. The devil had Jesus put to death because he thought that he had defeated God, which again, on the face of it, is absurd. But we're saying the devil is twisted. Herod's twisted. Yes.
The way they got us pure blood, they tried us to put yourself.
I think, yeah. I think in a very big way that's true.
And they also didn't understand like what that Jesus was God and man.
Yeah, and that's true too. He was
just God. There was no but there was no incarnation. He was just a man who was sent to lead Israel.
Exactly. The devil was not sure about Jesus' divine identity, and that came up in the past, and it's going to come up again when we see the temptation in the wilderness. But remember, the devil keeps asking Jesus, if you're the Son of God, command that these stones become bread. If you're the Son of God, because the devil's trying to find out. He doesn't know for sure. Because he's not omniscient. He's very, very knowledgeable, but he's not omniscient. Okay. So they said to him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for it is written, for thus it is written by the prophet, but you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not the least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. So on the one hand, it's just worth mentioning that Bethlehem is a really humble little hamlet, and it is the place where David the king is from, but it's not. It is a very humble little village. And notice how the Magi, the first thing they do when they get to Jerusalem, when they get to the area where they go immediately to the palace. And chances are, when they got to the palace, they were waiting to find Herod's son or something. They were looking for the boy who was born. And why wouldn't he be born in the palace? So on the one hand, God is defying expectation, being born in a humble, small, forgotten village. It's not a major city by any means. Okay, but you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. So that's in Micah chapter 5, verse 2. So let's look at that. And it'll be an important lesson in kind of what does prophecy mean and how do we understand it. So here we have Micah chapter 5, verse actually it's 1 in your Orthodox Study Bible. But in you, O Bethlehem, house of Ephrathah, though you are fewest in number among the thousands of Judah, yet out of you shall come forth to me one who shall be one to be ruler of Israel. His goings forth were from the beginning, even from everlasting. So it's helpful whenever you see one of these prophecies pop up in the gospel, go to it and see the expanded context, because it's helpful to read it. And therefore he shall give them up until the appointed time for her to give birth, and the remnant of their brothers will return to the sons of Israel, and he shall stand and see and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, and they will dwell in their glory in the name of their God, and for now they will be magnified on the earth, so on. But you see some mysterious dimensions. Okay, there's a Messiah coming. He's going to rule Israel. He's going to be born in Bethlehem of Judea, Bethlehem and Ephrathah. So far, so good. But then you get to the weird statements that actually do not show up in this, which is his goings forth were from the beginning, even from the everlasting. The Messiah is a human king. That's a bit of what does that mean exactly? His goings forth were from the beginning, from everlasting. I mean, it's hinting at the divinity of Jesus Christ right there on the face of it. It's not an explicit statement, but what would it even mean to say a human being is going forth from the beginning, even from everlasting? It's very strange and mysterious. Obviously, the Jews, when they tell this to Herod, they deliberately leave that part out, because what does that mean? How can we interpret it? They just didn't even understand it. But just it's helpful whenever you see one of these prophecies come up. There's usually more context than is quoted in the gospel, and it helps. It shines extra light. Verse 7. Then Herod, when he had secretly called the wise men, determined from them what time the star appeared. And remember, we said the star appeared as many as 2 years before. So it's And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the young child, and when you have found him, bring back word to me so that I may come and worship him also." One is that obviously Herod conceals evil intention under the guise of piety and humility. So just be aware of that. That's something the devil does. That's something human beings do. They disguise something wicked as something good. Oh, I want to go bow down and humbly offer worship for the King of Judah. No, he doesn't. He wants to kill him, so he gets him out of the way. So just it's a characteristic of evil among human beings, among angels, to disguise evil with good. So don't even trust your own thoughts. You might have a good thought or a good intention to do something good or that appears to you good, but it's actually a temptation you didn't even realize because you're spiritually immature or what have you, or you're blinded by your own hope of gain. Anyway, and notice that also that an encounter with God doesn't make everyone good. It can make the wicked worse. So that's why, we have to share our faith and we have to preach. But we have to do it with discernment, and that's why maybe street preaching or something like that is not the way we do things in the Orthodox Church, or it's not a very good tactic necessarily, because not everyone, even if you explained everything perfectly clearly and you have very good arguments or whatever, it doesn't mean it's going to hit them the right way, and it doesn't mean it's going to actually cause a conversion. Some people react to the coming of God intensely negatively. And it causes them to be evil and to do evil. So just be aware of that. Preach and share your faith, but do it with discernment and with understanding. Gosh, this is a whole thing, but it's worth mentioning that when Moses keeps going to Pharaoh and saying, "Let my people go," it says God hardens Pharaoh's heart. God hardens Pharaoh's heart, and then Pharaoh refuses to let them go, and God sends another plague. And a lot of people have read that and said, "Oh my gosh, like Pharaoh would have just let him go if God didn't harden his heart. Why is God continually hardening his heart and using it as an excuse to torment the Egyptians?" And St. John Cassian chimes in with a very, very interesting comment that God hardens Pharaoh's heart the way the sun hardens clay. It wasn't that God was choosing to make Pharaoh do evil so that he'd have an excuse to punish him. But it's just the mere coming of God caused Pharaoh to react very negatively, because he was wicked in and of himself, and that's the person he chose to be. And I'd say something analogous is going along with Herod here. It's not that God's making him do evil, but just the coming of God, just the awareness of God sets him off, in a sense. Okie dokie. 9, when they heard the king, they departed, and behold, the star which they had seen in the east went before them till it came and stood over where the young child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceedingly great joy. And when they had come into the house, they saw the young child with Mary his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented gifts to him, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So what's really interesting, and there's a lot of commentary on, is the star leads the Magi as far as Jerusalem. Why don't the Magi keep just following it all the way? Why do they stop and consult Herod? Well, it means that the star disappeared. They're following at a certain distance. They get to Jerusalem, and it's gone. Otherwise, they would have just kept following it right to the same place. But after they leave Herod, after they consult the scribes and leaders of the Jews, then the star reappears and leads them to the exact spot. What's going on here? That's a bit strange, right? So the fathers see that there is a deliberate attempt to bring the Magi into contact with Herod and the chief priests and the scribes, in order, in one sense, to convict them. So on one level, they have an excuse. This was their moment to say, hey, something really important is going on. Hey, maybe we should listen to these ancient prophets. Hey, maybe we should wake up. And they failed that test, obviously. They reacted in exactly the wrong way. But it was God giving them an opportunity to say, look, the Gentiles are coming from a very long journey. I mean, it could have taken them months to have gotten there. And chances are, you see in your imagination, you see it even in the icons or on TV, it's just 3 wise men riding on horses. Chances are it was a whole caravan, because that's how people traveled back then. So this was, and these are, wealthy, illustrious people. It was probably a big deal that this whole train of foreigners came in to Jerusalem and started stirring things up. That was an opportunity for people to repent, and they did not take it. But instead, they collaborated with Herod to kill Jesus. And so the star represents Christ. The Magi lose sight of Christ when they talk to Herod. Remember, Herod is the devil. Herod is a stand-in for the devil. So the Magi come to Jerusalem, they talk to Herod, and they can't see the star anymore. So when you're following Christ and then you turn to interact with the devil, the light of Christ disappears. However, when you stop consulting the devil and turn to find Christ again, he will take you right to him. So so some of the fathers, I forget which ones, saw a real beautiful metaphor for repentance here. I thought that was very interesting. In general, and I've said this in our last class, and I'll keep saying it, when the holy saints of our church are reading the text of the Bible, they're looking for lessons everywhere. They don't just want to know about what happened in the past. They want to know, how can I apply this to my life right now? Or what metaphors do I see about the spiritual life? And this is another one. It's really quite interesting, I think, because it involves a very close and really detailed reading of the text, because I had never in my life before, reading these commentaries, thought, well, hang on, the star must have disappeared. It just never crossed my mind. But why would they start following the star, stop following the star, start following the star again? But the fathers are all about that sort of thing, is they're looking for the things that don't quite line up. They're looking for the little stumbling blocks, because they're calling our attention to something deep. Super cool. Okay. And they notice it says, when they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceeding great joy. So they knew the path to Christ, and the encounter with God and finding God is the ultimate delight. Exceeding great joy. That's sort of glib. That's just what is it? 5 words: rejoiced with exceeding great joy. But the Gospels are not super detailed. That's a big statement, honestly. That's a real Bible most of the time doesn't tell us what people are feeling necessarily, unless it's important. And so it has a lesson for us, and that's to find God is a joyous thing. In fact, it's the ultimately maximally joyful thing. Yes. It's a really interesting question. And I don't know. Maybe they would have suspected him because he would have gone out with a troop of soldiers or something. I don't know. That's a really interesting question. I don't know. Yeah, he probably. Why follow him if they're going to just bring him to you or something like that? Maybe It's really worth pondering, though. That's the kind of question that's worth examining deeper and thinking about and seeing what information you can.
You're entirely right about that repentance thing. About just like the star disappearing, but it's obvious now that I'm reading it. But like, it wasn't just Herod; it was his entire court.
Yeah.
Everybody, they all
This
knew him.
this must have been. I mean, it says when Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, in all Jerusalem with him. This must have been a big kerfuffle, right? That when this whole train of foreigners is coming into town with a lot of fanfare or to do. It should have been a wake up call, but it wasn't. So they fell down and worshipped him. So even though he appeared as just a baby, the star in the prophets showed that there was something greater. Nothing else testified to Jesus' identity. I mean, this was it was poverty the likes of which we can't even really imagine. Really the conditions they must have lived in. This was extremely humble. I mean, this wasn't, like I said, this wasn't right when he was born. But if you think about like the fact that they laid him in a manger, they laid him in a trough for animals to eat out of. I mean, my goodness, my wife would have gone ballistic. When you think about it, but that's sort of the poverty we're talking about. They don't even have a proper bed or nursery or something like that. It's a little animal. Yes.
Is there any record came from the Magi spreading the word of God, because they saw him and believed?
I don't know. Keep in mind, history is a black hole. Most of what happened, we don't have any record of at all. I don't know. But if someone has some idea, let me know. But I have never heard of it, no. A continuous theme of Jesus's life is that people had some sense that he was someone special, but until his crucifixion and resurrection, even his own disciples didn't really have a handle on who he was and what his purpose was. So they knew he was the Messiah, they knew he was the King of the Jews, but what did that mean, or what was that going to end up looking like? I don't know. So they worshipped him, and this testifies to the faith that the Magi had, that they were, going to up to a child in these, really, and they're wise men, probably. We don't know for sure, but probably educated, probably wealthy, and so on. And they're falling at the feet of this child, this poor child, this nobody in the backwater of the Roman Empire. It's very strange, but it testifies to their faith, and they actually give him the treasures, which were probably very useful for them when they fled into Egypt. It's probably, it doesn't say that, but that's probably God preparing them, because they have to pick up and leave their homes. So what's all about the gold, frankincense, and myrrh? Well, pretty unanimously, it's gold is a gift you give to a king, incense is something you offer to God, and myrrh is something you offer for the dead. So on the one hand, it testifies that Christ is king. On the other hand, it is God, and on the other hand, that he's born in the world to die for the sins of men. But also some, see other metaphors, the three gifts because of three persons of the Trinity, three for the different nations of the world, because Christ is going to unite the nations of the world. Why would three be the number for that? Well, all human beings, per the traditional interpretation of Genesis, are descended from Noah's three sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. So roughly, Japheth was the father of Japheth was the father of Europeans. Shem was the father of like Asians or most Asians, and then probably by extension North Americans, and then and Ham was the father of Africans. And so it'd be uniting these three great groups of humanity. And also, I think it was Bede, or so the church father Venerable Bede, I think, who might have said the three virtues we must profess. Gold is representative of wisdom, because in Proverbs, wisdom is likened to gold. Incense is prayer for obvious reasons, and myrrh is mortification of bodily lusts. So three things a Christian must have. It's very interesting. Again, they're just looking for lessons everywhere. They're looking for things we can use and apply, because it's not abstract knowledge for knowledge's sake, but the fathers want to get their hands dirty and do stuff. Yes?
It says wise men, they brought three gifts, but does does it specify how many wise men or just how many gifts?
No, that's a really good question. And I think later tradition might put him at 3, but I remember when I was reading this, at least one of the fathers said, we don't know how many wise men there were. The text never specifies. I do think some later traditions gave them names. And I know what's that?
Was it Belshazzar was one of them.
Uh-huh.
But this is pure, it's make believe. There's no history.
Gaspar, no, sure.
Oh yeah, Gaspar.
I make up 3 names and say that's,
And so who knows? Who knows if that was their names or if that was just, later tradition someone made up to fill in the blanks, but it's interesting. Okay. Then, being divinely warned in a dream that they should not return to Herod, they departed for their own country in another way. So notice on the one hand that the Magi were totally guileless. They were probably ready to go back to Herod. They suspected nothing because there's a certain innocence about them. And so God protected them for their innocence and for their humility in following him. They should not return to Herod. Once someone has found Christ, he does not or should not return to the devil. Again, Herod is the stand-in for the devil again and again. Once you found Christ, don't go back to the devil. Obviously. Okay, 13. Now, when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, now I think this is the 3rd time that Joseph has been communicated, that God has communicated with Joseph in a dream in this gospel. And again, it's hammering really hard the connections between him and the patriarch Joseph, who in Egypt, was an interpreter of dreams. So Israel was also led. So arise, take the young child and his mother, flee to Egypt, and stay there until I bring you word. For Herod will seek this young child to destroy him. So, by the way, notice again how much of the Old Testament is coming to sort of fruition here. Who brought Israel into Egypt to begin with? It was Joseph. Joseph had been sold into slavery by his brothers. He was bought by the Egyptians. He eventually ended up rising through the ranks. He became the right-hand man of Pharaoh. And when he was the right-hand man of Pharaoh, he had this really successful agricultural policy whereby they were able to store grain for 7 years. So then all of the nations of the world came to Egypt to buy their grain because of Joseph's brilliant economic policy. And that's when Joseph, as the number 2 of Egypt, invites his family to come live in Egypt. And actually, the Jews, the Israelites, are prosperous in Egypt for a period of time before they get enslaved by a later Pharaoh who had forgotten about Joseph. So Joseph, the son of Jacob, takes Jesus into Egypt. And also Joseph, the son of Jacob, takes Israel into Egypt. One thing we're going to see in just a second is that Jesus sort of recapitulates in his own person the history of the people of God. So flee to Egypt. So God sends Christ to Egypt as a sign of reconciliation after the 10 plagues. That's really interesting. And this was from more than one father, but God sends Egypt. They said that God sends the Christ into Egypt is some sort of blessing to Egypt and some sign that he wants to reconcile Egypt to himself. I thought that was really neat. After everything that happened with the Exodus, if you don't remember, go watch The Prince of Egypt. And it's also used to establish a precedent, which I thought was interesting, because again, a lot of these fathers are writing with the memory of persecution fresh in their mind. I think most of these fathers were writing in the post-Constantinian era, when Christianity was legal. But one of the things they gained from this is that if it was okay for Christ to flee to Egypt, then it's okay for Christians to flee from places where they're persecuted. You can become a martyr. It's good to become a martyr. You'll go, fast pass to heaven, but you have the right to flee. You don't have to just sit and take it. Herod is seeking the child to destroy him. And just notice, don't forget that Jesus Christ is God, but he is fleeing to avoid being destroyed. So he's obviously, we know that from the crucifixion, that he is vulnerable. He's a real human being, and he's also God. And it's very interesting. Then Herod, when he saw that he was deceived by the wise men, was exceedingly angry, and he sent forth and put to death all the male children who were in Bethlehem and in all its districts, 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had determined from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah the prophet, saying, "A voice was heard in Ramah, lamentation, weeping, and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, refusing to be comforted because they are no more." So, so a couple things. One is that Herod was exceedingly angry. So it's not just like, oh, shucks, I missed the Christ, or the wise men deceived me. He flew into a rage. And again, one thing we see again and again in Herod is, he has all these opportunities to make the right choice, and he's continually like choosing something worse. And so he lashes out at anyone he can get his hands on, basically, in his arrogance and wounded pride. And that's kind of the nature of evil, and that's the nature of pride. Is to destroy like that. So we've sent forth and put to death all the male children. Now these are the first martyrs for Christ, as all the commentators say, and they go straight to heaven. So the first martyrs for Christ, they're saved. They prefigure later martyrs who are killed with innocence, right? Because the Christians who are put to death under the Roman emperors or under communists or Muslims or whatever are innocent. The only crime they've committed is believing in Christ or refusing to worship the emperor as a god, or refusing to worship some false god. But they're not actually criminals who've done something evil or done something unkind. And so and Herod put to death all the male children who were in Bethlehem and in all its districts. So on the one hand, you can say maybe Herod was just being thorough. But on the other hand, it's just the wantonness of, I'm not even going to kill all the children in Bethlehem. I'm going to kill the children who are near Bethlehem. I'm going to kill the children who've ever heard of Bethlehem. Okay, not the last one, but it's just so excessive and unnecessary that it's kind of showing his character really deeply. And that's going to be relevant in a minute. So then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah, what was saying. So this is one of the places where our Orthodox Study Bible is going to be significantly different from the Jewish text. It's the Greek version of Jeremiah is a good bit different from the Hebrew version of Jeremiah, at least in the order of where things are. So in the Hebrew version, this is in Jeremiah 31, but in the Greek version, it's in Jeremiah 38. So in your Orthodox Study Bible, it's Jeremiah chapter 38, verse 15. Thus says the Lord, a voice of lamentation, weeping and mourning was heard in Ramah. Rachel does not wish to cease mourning deeply over her children because they are no more. Remember, let's read a little longer in the passage. Thus says the Lord, let your voice cease from its bitter weeping and your eyes from tears, for there is a reward for your works, and they shall return from the land of your enemies. There shall be an abiding home for your children. So that's why the fathers get first of all, what is this passage about? When Jeremiah originally spoke this, or when he wrote this, or what have you, this was about the children of Israel going into the Babylonian captivity. Their capital city had been destroyed, and they were being marched as slaves into a foreign land. That's why Rachel was crying. So what we have this idea, and I've said this in the past, but prophecy is not always about a prediction being fulfilled. Oh, God said that a Messiah is going to come in Bethlehem, and here he comes in Bethlehem. God said a virgin would give birth, and here a virgin gives birth. Part of what prophecy is, or can be, is the pattern of God's activity repeating itself in a new way. So just as we saw this happening, the people of God being unjustly oppressed, and then God comforting them by saying, you will return to your home. So when God says this originally, he's saying, let your voice cease from its bitter weeping and your eyes from tears, for there is a reward for your works, and they shall return from the land of their enemies. What he's saying in the immediate context is that they're going to come back from Babylon. Nothing about children being, in the immediate context, there's nothing about children being slaughtered. There's nothing about the massacre of the innocents at Bethlehem. But when we see these repeated patterns showing up, when we see the resonance between these events, we are looking and saying, oh, God's hand was at work there then, now it's at work here again. These are part of the same continuous history. So that's another way in which prophecy works. It's not just always a fulfilled prediction. So just keep in mind, why do we know these babies are saved? Was in part because we just know that innocent people are not going to go to hell. But on the other hand, God says, there shall be an abiding home for your children. That's it. And of course, this is historically been always used to relate to the victims of abortion, because as I've said a bajillion times, that that's not a modern thing. There was always ways to terminate a pregnancy, even in ancient times. And one of the things that always distinguished Christians, always from the very first days, is that we love babies. We love, it was no abortion for children, but also Christians in the ancient times would go out. There's a lot of infant exposure back then. People would take unwanted babies, especially girls, and leave them out in the wilderness, either to die and be eaten by animals, or to be captured by a slaver, and then they would be raised as slaves. And Christians would go out and find them in the wilderness and take them in and raise them and give them dignity in life. So there's always been this sense in which we have a very strong concern for the innocent, especially children, the innocence of children. Okay, so I also, sorry, this is relevant because Rachel was buried in Ephrathah near Bethlehem. So obviously Rachel is long dead. She was the wife of one of the wives of Jacob, but this is the relevance. And also some of the commentators say Rachel refuses to be comforted either because she thinks that children are permanently dead, or because she knows they have paradise. So one of the two reasons she's refusing to be comforted, either because she doesn't want to be consoled because there's no hope, or she doesn't need to be consoled because there's so much hope. It's kind of opposite, but interesting. Okay. Now, when Herod was dead, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, "Arise, take the young child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the young child's life are dead." Then he arose, took the child and his mother, and came to the land of Israel. Here's a really neat thing, because obviously Herod was first of all, this is all real historical events, but Herod was a figure we know from outside of the Bible, because he was a person of significance, and so one of the sources we know about him was the Jewish historian Josephus, who talks about him. So Josephus, who lived around the time of Christ, mentions a little bit of Christ and his movement, but doesn't focus on him very much. But he has a lot to say about Herod, and one of the things he documents the way Herod dies. And by the way, it's pretty clear in Josephus that Herod's a very wicked man, evil man, not just for the killing of the innocents. Anyway, according to Josephus, again, this is not even part of the Bible, but this is just a secular history. Herod basically, he died in paranoia and craziness, and then he got this terrible disease where he had a fever, and among other things, worms basically ate his penis. Yeah. So it's I know it's kind of out of nowhere, but it was just some really hideous, ugly disease. Is how he ended his life. So the fathers, when they're commenting on this passage, are saying, "Look what happened to Herod. Don't be like Herod." He basically rotted in his flesh. He rotted in the most sensitive part of his flesh. Because of his wickedness, and that was just, and I think especially back then, there's a lot more of association of the way someone dies. If it's bad, it's a bad sign about who they were. Yeah, I've read Dune, but I forgot about that one in specific. It's probably very similar, like archetype, right? The big, fat, corrupt, evil ruler. Who dies in his corruption, or interesting. And one of the interesting things, again, that we also know, notice it says those who sought the young child's life are dead, not just Herod. And part of it is actually, again, we know from Josephus, from outside the Bible, that Herod actually had a number of his top men killed closer to the end of his life because of his paranoia. And the court intrigues and stuff. So the story ends badly for everyone who tried to kill Jesus, which is really interesting. And again, that's it. I don't love using the term objective, but that's objective. That is something not even that the Bible's telling us, but that we know from a different historical source. So anywho, really neat. So arise, take the young child and his mother. Again, fourth time, an angel of the Lord appears to Joseph in a dream, because Joseph is the king of dreams. Those who, but just notice that the overall message that those who persecute the church will not prosper. The church remains. And think of how many Roman emperors persecuted Christians. Where's Rome? It's gone. Christianity, Orthodoxy, still here. The Ottoman Empire, guess what? They're gone. Well, Erdogan's trying to bring it back, but we'll see. Communism, the Soviet Union, where's that? Gone. It's dead. Orthodox Church is still here. So this is a very this sort of pattern. Oh yeah, I forgot the prophecy out of Egypt I've called my son in in Hosea 11:1. We won't flip to it, but that's back. I forgot to comment on it. But basically, it's important, and you'll see it more and more in the Gospel of Matthew, especially because we said Gospel of Matthew he's mentioning all these prophecies. Gospel of Matthew is very concerned with Jewish subjects, and one of the things is that Jesus, like with this prophecy, Jesus lives out in his life. He recapitulates himself in his own life, everything that Israel did. So Egypt, Israel gets brought to Egypt by Joseph, and then brought out of Egypt. Out of Egypt I've called my son. Christ goes to Egypt and then comes back into the promised land. Israel wandered in the desert for 40 years. Christ was tempted for 40 days in the wilderness. Christ is in some way a physical embodiment of his people. Where else do we see that? Well, we see it elsewhere in the New Testament when the church is referred as to literally the body of Christ. So the church, Christ lives out in his person the life of his people, and the people live out in their person the life of Christ. There's this really interesting resonance there, and that's why we see things like the church being persecuted so much throughout her history, like even in recent times by the communists and so on and so forth, because the church lives the life of Jesus in herself because she's his body. Anyway, fun. So the fathers say, also another thing, when Herod was dead, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in Egypt. And again, just like the patristic commentaries, they go in directions you don't expect them to. And one of the things that come up again and again is they really see a lot of significance in the fact that Jesus went to Egypt. They don't specify in any way, but they seem to talk as though Jesus is doing some type of service to Egypt just by going there. He's being a blessing to Egypt. He's doing something good for them. And he had some kind of mission to fulfill by, I don't know, somehow just by physically going to Egypt, he was fulfilling some sort of mission to the Egyptians. Interesting. So it's not just this like pause in Jesus's life. And then when he goes to Egypt, and then he gets back to the good stuff when he goes back to Israel and continues living. No, there was a purpose in going to Egypt. What and how it worked, I don't know. Anywho. Okay, and then we're gonna stop there. And we'll finish up this last part and then go into Matthew 3 in the next one. But any questions, comments, concerns before we wrap up? Okay, Christ our God, you're the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. You have completed the divine plan of the Father. Fill our hearts with joy and gladness, now and ever into the ages of ages. Amen. Okay, God bless you guys. Thanks for being here. As usual, I'll hang out to answer questions or just to chat, but